With Edward, he had an idea. His job as an intellectual is to empower people to be able to act. So for him, then the intellectual was, are you one who stands to serve the interests of people at large, or do you support the powers that be? He was trying to look at systems of domination. Orientalism is not only an idea, but a system of domination of the other. Orientalism is a difficult book in any language. The old Orientalists, Bernard Lewis, who occupied the important position at Princeton University, he reviewed the book 5 years after its publication. They saw it as Edward Said is an interloper. He's not a specialist. So why is he intervening on our territory? The official academy was weary and tired of it, and they tried to dismiss it, but they couldn't. In the end, the word Orientalism became such a negative term that departments that used to have Oriental studies changed it. We have entered a new phase in American life in universities where ideas are viewed as dangerous and they have to be stopped, and specifically ideas about Israel and Zionism.
Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, I'm really honored to be joined by Nubar Hovsepian, who is the author of Edward Said, The Politics of an Oppositional Intellectual, that came out recently on AUC Press. Nubar, welcome so much to the series.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Maybe a good way to start is, since we're talking about this book in general, do you remember when you first met Edward Said? Do you remember the time and place?
Yeah. We knew of each other before that date. I met him in 1975. I was living in Beirut, and I was about to. If I didn't leave that day, I would not have left because the airport closed.
Which month in 1975?
Beginning of Civil War.
Wow.
So I caught the last flight out. Then, of course, it reopened. Went to Chicago to attend the conference of the Arab American University graduates. And I actually mentioned about how Edward, the first time I met him, he seemed a bit flustered and not articulate in public. This is the conference. That persona was to be developed within the next year or two, because he had to take a more public space. So it was in Chicago at the American University, Arab American University Graduates Conference, and I was invited to give a presentation, and we met during that conference formally before we knew of each other.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like figures who earn a lot of fame and earn a lot of acclaim, a lot of times the only thing that increases is the number of people who misunderstand them, because people sort of know a little bit about their work and know a little bit about their name. I'm curious, what do you think people most misunderstand about who Edward Said, the person, was, and the intellectual he was?
See, I think the person depends on what literature they have been introduced to by Said. Now, I'll give you an example. When Edward went to India, he was so impressed by the journalists. They had read and devoured every one of his books. Right? So they looked at him as his oeuvre as a complete set. The journalists in the Arab world looked at his political writings. So no culture and imperialism, no Orientalism, etc. You see what I mean? No literary theory and what have you. Of course, there are some who did look at that, but we're just making broad comparisons. So first and foremost is the biggest misunderstanding in the Arab world is over the issue of Orientalism. Was Edward pro-Islam? Was Edward anti-West? None of that applies to his work on Orientalism. He is looking at a system of the production of knowledge of the other, right? So that's, I think, probably people claim them to be Saif al-Islam or things like that. I find those to be rather silly claims, infantile claims, but they were made. So that's I think the principal misconception about Edward and his
Typically,
work.
and his work. Typically when people come across, when you speak, you spent a career as a professor, when you would speak to students who referenced him, do you feel like they kind of miss the point at all in any sort of essential way?
It depends on how you teach, right? Now, for example, I remember once I was teaching a seminar on ways of studying the Middle East. And one of the books assigned was Orientalism. I spent 2 seminar sessions, that's 6 hours, 2 out of 14 sessions on the first 28 pages to deconstruct Said's introduction, to arm students with the vocabulary they need, with the ways in which he distinguishes himself from prior writers. So he says, I disagree with Foucault on this. Well, if you don't know Foucault, you're kind of lost, right? So once you do that, then they understand. But if you just tell them, go read it on your own, Orientalism is a difficult book in any language. Right, and it is, and Said made a point after Orientalism to write in a different style. That Orientalism had a turgid quality to it, a difficult quality, because partially he's dealing with so many ideas of multiple languages, right? Then he decided over time that he has to have a mission of communicating. So he adopted what Adorno called the essay as form to communicate more readily to his audience, right? And that essay form took articles in Al Majalla, in other newspapers, in Al Ahram Weekly, etc. Right? Plus his books, his political books and his cultural books. So I would say that Said is, you have to look at his oeuvre as a complete oeuvre. And unfortunately, people either look at his politics or his theoretical work, but they don't merge the two together. It's the same man.
When you first came across the book Orientalism, did you ever think to yourself, oh, wow, this is going to be a global success? This will show up on every single curriculum, post-colonial curriculum in the world. This will be mandatory reading with the sort of Frantz Fanon and other texts like that. Did you think to yourself, this is going to be
well,
smash
let me tell you my initial reaction. I was in New York City. I had just moved back from Beirut to New York. And I got the book, read it in one night, literally overnight. And then I sent a short note to Edward saying, wow. I knew it was difficult, but I was mesmerized by the book because it said what so many others tried to say, but he put it all together. There are people prior to Edward who introduced those topics, right? The term post-colonial is not available yet in 1978 when the book comes out. That's a subject that develops in the next 2-3 years after the book. So I thought it was an important work. I thought it captured something that he put together an argument that others have tried to do in part. He put it together as one large narrative.
Hmm. What was the reaction of the sort of academy when this book came out? Was it heralded as an important sort of a pivotal moment, or was it rejected? How was it received?
Well, look, the academy is many academies, all right? So the old Orientalists, Bernard Lewis, who occupied the important position at Princeton University, right? And they reproduced their ideas by occupying those departments. He reviewed the book 5 years after its publication. He still tried to dismiss it because he couldn't, right? They saw it as Edward Said is an interloper. He's not a specialist. So why is he intervening on our territory? Now, on the other hand, younger scholars, like a friend of mine, Anne Norton, brilliant political theorist, she's even in my age, I imagine, at the University of Pennsylvania. She said, look, when this book came out, it resonated with us. All the things we were thinking about were there in front of us. So the critical members of academe welcomed it and embraced it. Then, of course, critiqued it. Any good book should be critiqued. The official academy was weary and tired of it, and they tried to dismiss it, but they couldn't. Right? So that in the end, the word Orientalism became such a negative term that departments that used to have Oriental studies changed it. The University of Pennsylvania being one of them. Right?
So let me ask you a question. In 1978, was somebody like Bernard Lewis a proud Orientalist? Was that a dirty word in 1978?
No. He claims that Said made it so. Right? He was a proud Orientalist, meaning that he produces the knowledge that is necessary to learn about other parts of the world through the framework that he and his cohorts suggested. Because he is joined 10 years later by Sam Huntington, his work on, how to look at the other, right? And Islam as a major threat to the
This
way
is the Clash
we
of
live in the world.
Civilizations guy.
The clash of civilizations, yeah. So, and what's interesting, the clash of civilizations as a term is actually coined by Bernard Lewis in one of his articles, and Sam Huntington borrows that for the title of his article that later became a book. Much too worthy of a book, not worth a book. The article was sufficient.
Yeah. I want to go back to, maybe this is something to talk about later.
Sure.
But let me just ask you now, what do you think Said would have thought about how Columbia University is behaving in 2025?
He would probably do the same thing that Rashid Khalidi did. Rashid has formally retired, and he was due to teach a course because they couldn't find a replacement for him. So he obliged Columbia to stay. It's a very large class on Middle East that he teaches history. And then he wrote a open letter to the Columbia president, published in The Guardian in England, saying, I can't go on and assume that nothing has changed. You are not the university I know, right? I think he would be bold enough, Edward, to say that. Now, to his credit and to the credit of the generation around him, the provost, who was a friend of his, defended him to the hilt. When Edward was always attacked, he had the luxury of saying what he wanted without being threatened by the university, unlike now. We have entered a new phase in American life in universities where ideas are viewed as dangerous and they have to be stopped, and specifically ideas about Israel and Zionism.
Yeah. It's interesting because, in some ways, the environment in which Said was writing in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the defense of Zionism in the States was higher. And the level of awareness of its the dangers of Zionism
Yeah.
was lower.
Very much so.
بس بنفس الوقت he was protected enough to be writing, whereas now it's out in the open. The number of people in the US who are aware of the dangers of Zionism is enormous. Yeah.
See, there's a lot has changed. Clearly, Said opened up many doors for people to be critical. So, for example, in his book, The Question of Palestine, the second chapter is Zionism viewed from the standpoint of its victims. Now, that's an interesting notion because most American scholarship and in Jewish circles, Zionism and victimhood are not, they don't compute. Said introduced that, said, okay, so you have some rights, but your rights do not include walking all over me and sidelining me and dispossessing me. Right. So there he adopts and develops the idea, which was earlier on developed by Maxime Rodinson about settler colonial idea. Right. So Said adopts it, develops it, and then a huge number of authors subsequent to that. While Said was writing, the only other person he could rely on as a friend was Noam Chomsky. Then the rest, all liberal intelligentsia, is pro-Israeli. Right? Zionism is seen as sacrosanct, right? He begins to chip away at it, and particularly within the humanities, right? The humanities saw what he was doing, and a lot of the intellectuals and scholars writing within the humanities and literature and philosophy and comparative literature and the social sciences began to see the importance, right? Because there is a historical record to look at. He opened up a door that others joined in. So a few years ago, somebody like Peter Beinart. Peter Beinart's first book, the first line says, "I'm a Zionist." When you hear him now, you say, "Wait a minute." He says that doesn't apply anymore. He understands things because also his South African origins. He sees apartheid just before his eyes, living and thriving, which is dangerous, right? So the mood has changed. Among youth has changed. Look, 23 senators voted against arming Israel for a very limited resolution. You couldn't get one senator 3 years ago to do that, right? Over 50% of the youth in the Democratic Party no longer buy the argument of Israel at all cost, our strategic ally. That has changed. What has not changed is the rigidity and the tenacity of policymakers and people who are in power. That hasn't changed.
I want to talk about the subtext of the book, which is the politics of an oppositional intellectual. Can you help define what you think that means? Politics of an oppositional intellectual.
Right. Look, in the back of my mind, I thought, look, there are a lot of intellectuals who are referred to as public intellectuals, and to be honest, there's a dime a dozen of those kinds. Right?
They're usually more public than they are intellectual.
Precisely, right? Whereas, see, with Edward, he had an idea, right? The oppositional meaning that his job as an intellectual is to empower people to be able to act, to seek justice. So his ideas are not highfalutin, right? Both he and Chomsky, and I define this very clearly in the book, that they see it as not, usually people define these intellectuals as, people who are kind of opposed to power, speaking truth to power. No, he wanted people to act on behalf of truth to alter power equations. So for him, then the intellectual was, are you one who stands to serve the interests of people at large, or do you support the powers that be? Right. So to me, the oppositional intellectual is one who sees, who makes a conscious decision to support the ideas and the movements that project the need for justice and just human decency. Right? That's what his intellectual does. So that's why he affiliates with the liberation ideas. That's why he affiliates with ideas that break down existing consensus about war, about gender, about etc. Right? So
Yeah.
he does that.
In order to be an intellectual, an oppositional intellectual, do you have to be, or does one have to be more or less, more pessimistic than the average person, or more optimistic than the average person?
Well, I think Edward and I always referred to Gramsci's notion of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, right? I mean, let's face it, the reality is right now it's very pessimistic, right? Especially, I mean, we're talking across multiple divides. I'm here in New Jersey, you are in Beirut, and the situation around you, the geography around you, it's not very optimistic, right? So, but at some point, something has to change. So the optimism of the will is that ultimately people armed with good ideas and revived movements will be able to advocate for the type of change that is salutary, that improves the human condition, that addresses people's needs, right? So I am, it's like, what's his name, the Palestinian writer, متشائر, right? He puts together the term optimism and pessimism in one word. المتشائر, سعيد المتشائر. So I'm there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean,
Emil
if I can,
Habibi's work. Emil Habibi.
Amir
Yeah.
Habib.
Yeah.
I wonder, I asked the father of a friend of mine recently this question. I'll ask you the same question. If you were to track, or chart rather, your level of optimism about the situation, about Palestine, about the future of Palestine over the course of your career, what was the peak and what was the valley of that optimism?
I mean, look, the peak was the early 60s, where at least there's the beginnings of a Palestinian self-assertion, the need to remove the shackles of Arab state dominance of Palestinian political life, right? And the need to organize into a viable movement to advocate for Palestinian rights and self-determination. Now, immediately there is a problem. That is, the movement was founded also on a form of romanticism, right? They want to emulate Algeria, Vietnam. What? I mean, Vietnam, well, there was a Cold War. They had the Russian forces on their side, right? And China, right? We have no one, right? So to speak. So, and then second, the Palestinian movement writ large was correctly diagnosed the fact that they need to engage in militant struggle. But they equate all forms of militance with armed struggle. Sometimes I wonder, the most important form of militance is the ability to weaken the resolve of your adversary. So that's a criteria I would posit as the basis with which to establish whether what you're doing is useful or counterproductive, right? So I started thinking in the mid to late 70s that the practices of the Palestinian movement were not leading to the direction of liberation. We were then enthused with the uprisings that started, Intifada, the first one. And the first Intifada had the qualities that were important, that caught world attention. The second one, as Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza would refer to it, Intifadat al-Jidar. It brought us that. What else did it bring us? Right. I am critical, and I know a lot of friends, probably some of your listeners, will not like what I just said. I'm for liberation, but I also have to ask the question, how? What are the necessary tools we need? And how we can do it to advance. Struggling itself is not enough. You have to have criteria by which to advance. I'm not interested in just struggle for the sake of struggle. Struggle has to have a purpose to move forward.
So, as somebody who has spent a career and a lifetime thinking and working and observing, what would you advocate for, and what did Saeed advocate for?
See, Saeed,
and maybe you guys disagreed.
We agreed and disagreed on some things. I thought he was too soft on the PLO leadership for many years before he lambasted them, right? But that's neither here nor there, because remember, he was situated in New York. So the idea of being critical of your liberation movement is a bit difficult because, that's what you have. Right? So your job is to establish the basis of support and solidarity. But then he also is the critic who says, criticism before solidarity. Right? On that score, I think Saeed probably took some time before he had a good balance between criticism and before solidarity. Right? I think what Saeed always stood for is to think through what is it that we can do to advance the cause, right? So, and here he was informed by ideas from Iqbal Ahmad, his dear friend, Pakistani militant, brilliant scholar, brilliant writer, and all that, who introduced Edward to all sorts of ideas about national liberation movements, which he had studied thoroughly. And, Iqbal had studied particularly Algeria and Vietnam. So what you learn from that is, you must have the ability to weaken the resolve of your enemy and its principal supporters. The Palestinian movement failed miserably in creating the type of solidarity in the American context, which is one of the most important contexts, and they didn't really invest enough resources to build and ally with and expand the support that it was necessary. So he always advocated for that. He always believed that Palestinians have the right to self-determination. That includes the right to resist an armed struggle, but not exclusively. That there are other forms of struggle that sometimes would be more useful. So he was more nuanced in his understanding of what struggle means, right? He understood from his readings of people like, say, Amilcar Cabral, the head of the PAIGC. He was the theoretician of the African liberation movement against the Portuguese colonies. And he said, look, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. It's a beautiful essay that he wrote. I remember I wrote a long piece about Cabral and PAIGC in Beirut in the early 70s, before Cabral was assassinated by one of the Portuguese henchmen, right? So those ideas were central, right, to Edward, to think through clearly. He supported different ideas, He supported the idea of the democratic secular state, which is something that is introduced by the Palestinian movement in 1968, 69. But then he had to develop it further, right? What did the democratic secular state idea mean? Does it mean that you and your Jewish other are involved in a process to create that? Well, there are people in the Arab world who support the idea, who will not have anything to do with the other, the Jewish other, right? Edward was not of that kind. He felt that there is no solution outside of coexistence between the Jewish and the Palestinian side.
I want to talk about this idea of the democratic secular state and sort of basically what a viable one state solution would look like. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and early 2000s, when this was sort of being discussed and thought about, who were the biggest opponents, intellectual opponents to this idea?
It's tough to identify one individual or group. Everybody joined in within the Palestinian consensus in supporting the secular state. They just had different meanings for it. Like, I mean, I read all of the documents and I discussed them in detail, actually, in my book, comparing the Fatah view versus the Democratic Front versus the PFLP. And I find all of them a bit wanting. That is, do they mean a state of its citizens? This is precisely the understanding of post-apartheid South Africa, because we often refer to South Africa as a model to emulate of ending apartheid. Well, Mandela insisted that the future is all people in the land are citizens. Equality of citizenship. There is no hierarchy of preferred versus people less so. So in the 67, it was not a good. It was a good idea. Unfortunately, the idea was not fully developed, mostly because the Palestinian movement was under constant attack. Right. So there were attempts. They wanted to create that. They wanted the idea, but it was left undeveloped for good reason. Survival was the mode. And unfortunately, when you are in the survival mode, your ability to think of a better future gets a bit clouded, right? We're back to that same idea now, right? And former Zionists now saying, well, that's an anathema. We cannot go to that. We must have a state of its citizens. In this case, it's the Israeli Jews and Arabs and Palestinians, right? We have to reimagine it that way. And Said really thought always that there is no solution that excludes one or the other. But there is no solution if there is a domination that rules over the reality between the different parts of the people who are part of Palestine.
Yeah, as a professor or educator more broadly, I should say, are you noticing a significant shift? Or let me rephrase that: are the rumors of this significant shift in students overstated when it comes to how much people think, how much people care about Palestine and are beginning to humanize and sympathize with what's happening in Palestine?
Look, take the mayoral election in New York City with Mamdani. Okay? His father is a good friend of mine, a brilliant scholar, teaches at Columbia University. He is from Uganda, right? He's Asian from Uganda, right? Of Indian extract from Uganda. Now, Mamdani and his followers in the mayoral race have clearly situated themselves on the path of Palestinian rights, right? That arms to Israel need to be curtailed and stopped, right? So, in other words, there is a legitimate development among youth, right? And there's a big divide between youth and, say, people my age group. Although I am more with the youth than I am with my age group, in beginning to see that the Israeli project is an oppressive one, right? So there is a change. There is a change in discourse in various places. That's why the attempt to silence it is so violent and so massive, right? When Congress, forget Congress, when a state like Arkansas, an insignificant legislature, passes a resolution that says you cannot use the word West Bank and occupation in your curricula in the university. I mean, that's not a sign of strength. That's a sign that they have no argument. We've won the cultural and intellectual argument, but we don't have the power to alter the balance of power that could induce the type of change necessary. So it's a long haul. I wish that my generation would have been the one to see those changes, but I hope it's yours, but clearly not mine.
So what do you think, what advice do you give people who are activists and intellectuals, younger, I should say, activists and intellectuals, saying that, okay, well, there's so much fervor and there's so much energy around this stuff, but every single person has a different opinion. Every single person has a different sort of litmus test for what justice looks like, what truth looks like. Everyone, there isn't a organization to it. There isn't a clear coordination.
Look, take your context in Lebanon. The absence of such organization manifests itself in the perpetuation of your dominant confessional order, or civil war, etc., and that dominant order remained intact, right?
Yeah.
So I would say, look, we are in a moment of just, we have no clarity, right? People are tired. I think people need to hear language that makes sense rather than just sound right. I think we're too often engaged with rhetorical devices to say whether you are pure or not. I find all of that to be uninteresting and ultimately destructive. Right? You need to think clearly. Right? What my generation can do to your generation is tell you honestly what we experienced and what mistakes we made and why we remain optimistic that you can take it in a different direction.
Can I ask you about some of those mistakes? If you were to look back at the last 40 years, what are key moments where you might be harsh on yourself and say, these were mistakes? Or you might say, okay, we learned a lot from this. But what are some of the main missteps?
Let's address it
years?
in terms of the Lebanon context, right?
Okay.
I mean, the Palestinian movement more or less overshadowed its Lebanese counterpart. Now, that's not very smart. I mean, some people on the left figured that, wait a minute, no, we need to have a real alliance, and at that time, Jean Blot was still alive, Jean Blot, the father. Jean Blot, the son, was my classmate at AUB for 1 year. And there was room for, I mean, as John Block thought, that the French Revolution idea of transforming Lebanese into citizens rather than members of confessions, right? I think the Palestinian movement accepted that reality, didn't challenge it, but also helped reinforce it through its alliances and all that, right? Especially the dominant part of the Palestinian movement, right? So we kept repeating and reproducing the forms that alienate people from being who they are and what they need to be, and therefore they're individualized rather than part of a larger group, right? So that's one. Two, some of the practices that happen, you know, excessive militarization. I thought that, look, you have to give people hope. Excessive militarization meant that you have no solution other than firing a gun. Well, but most of the times, firing the gun did not produce a positive outcome. Okay, like the Palestinian movement from its first days in the Jordan phase, right? The Al Bayan would be produced of our fighters have crossed the river before they actually crossed the river, and within minutes after crossing the river, they were caught. Right, but the posters of Al Shuhada and all that, right? That, I don't like to celebrate martyrdom. I think we need to struggle for a better future, not to become martyrs. In the process, if you are martyred, that's fine. But your objective is not to be a martyr. Your objective is to liberate, to create a better life. So those are two attitudinal things, ideas, that I think caused a lot of errors. Right? We have large issues. The involvement of Arab states. So we had a huge number of adversaries. So I don't want to underestimate that, right? Because I think that would be irresponsible. But we didn't help ourselves as much as we could at that time. And therefore, you see in Lebanon, the most militant groups who were part of, say, the communist parties, etc., the Shia, they abandoned those parties and they become part of a Shia-based movement. It's fascinating for me how fast that transformation took place. It's partly the failure of the left. It's partly the failure of oppositional ideas in luring people, right? So people became tribalized. The Lebanese state did not care about them. And it seems neither did the opposition understand the conditions of that particular development taking place in Lebanon. Right? The same in Palestine, right? The idea of relying purely on armed struggle. So what does that mean? Right? You need to organize a lot more in the West Bank and Jerusalem, etc. Armed struggle is useful if it helps to weaken the resolve of your adversary. Right? I am very clear about that, and I take that from my readings of the revolutionary writings, and I deal with that very much in my work about what is a militant view on that. So it's important to just be critical of what we've done, right?
Yeah.
To think of ourselves as citizens, right? A few people in Lebanon think of themselves, the idea of citizenship rather than members of a confession.
Yeah.
That's
Is
where
that
we're at now.
Yeah, but is that the nature of opposition? Is the nature of the opposition, is the opposition always messy?
Opposition is always messy, but opposition also needs to learn in order to be able to advance its cause in a very judicious, effective manner, right?
Yeah.
That we haven't done yet. We had some really good ideas, right? The idea of a secular republic. It was a brilliant idea, but it didn't break down the confessional structures, right? That took place. The idea of a secular state in Palestine, but the term secular is used in a very peculiar and obscure manner. When they said democratic secular state, what did that mean? What was their conception of it? I argue that their conception was an Arab nationalist conception that does not deal with the realities of Palestine. Right. So,
But before you move on, tell me more about that. What do you think it actually meant, and what
I
do you
think
think people
democratic secular
misunderstood
state
it as?
really
Yeah.
meant أمة عربية واحدة ذات رسالة خالدة, and minorities are tolerated. You don't build a future that. The South African model is to see everyone as a citizen who has a stake in that project. Now, it's going to take time for us to reach what the South Africans were able to reach. But we did not share the idea of that the citizen of one project.
So the idea of being a citizen versus a subject
Precisely.
is the difference.
A subject means you become, in Lebanese terms, a Maronite or a Protestant or an Orthodox or a Shia or a Sunni, etc., or a Druze, etc.
Yeah.
The secular understanding is the whole is composed of a plurality, of a multiplicity of identities, but unified under the rubric of citizenship. We're all equal in our capacity of citizenship, in our function as citizens. We haven't reached that stage yet. So the dominant order prevails because of that.
I want to ask a question about Saeed's and also your relationship to America. Okay? Because Saeed is writing Orientalism and all of his other books and I'll quote one of my past podcast guests, in the belly of the beast.
Yeah,
right?
Precisely.
Did he view it as the belly of the beast? Did he think of himself, I just need to hold my nose and deal with all this America and write my work here? Or did he say, I'm cursed because the Arab world is no better and this place is no better. Khalas, I need to just do my work wherever I can do my work.
Look, there is no contradiction between seeing that the Arab world is cursed and I'm in the belly of the beast. Right? Yeah, because the Arab world raises issues of the difficulties of addressing our rights as people. The belly of the beast continues the notion of empire and support of the forces of empire that destroy our potential, our present and future, right? Through wars. Right? When you look at the area, right, we've had how many wars? There is no generation that's been spared wars, whether they are wars, civil wars, breakdown. I mean, we have ongoing civil wars where? In Sudan, Lebanon hasn't resolved itself yet. Syria is going through convulsions, right?
Yeah.
Etc. So Edward saw himself as in the belly of the beast, but at the same time, such a privileged position to be able to articulate the rights and of self-determination of Palestinians, of democratic rights in the Arab world. He was able to do that, right, through here, knowing fully well that the battle in the U.S. is crucial because U.S. funding for all of our enemies was also crucial, whether it is Israel or Arab states. Right? So Edward, for example, in his columns, he had to resign from his al-Majalla because over the Iraq war, right? Because of it's a Saudi-funded thing, and he basically reminded his Kuwaiti interlocutors, you guys were 100% behind Saddam's invasion, war against Iran. Right? What a waste. You wasted resources of Iraq and Iran.
And like a million people died.
And you helped consolidate Khomeiniism. Khomeiniism was not consolidated in 79. The war helped Khomeini consolidate, and therefore Saddam contributed to that consolidation.
Can I ask you one last question?
Sure, my pleasure.
If you were to put together a reading list for a 25-year-old or 18-year-old who comes to you and says, I've only heard of Edward Said min Ba'id. I've heard his name. I've heard of Edward, of Orientalism. But I want to spend the next year reading.
I would not read Orientalism right away because I think it's a difficult text. The Arabic translation destroyed it, right? Although the translator, is a fairly renowned comparative literature person in England, and he was a good friend of Said's. I remember, I was part of the publishing house that published Orientalism in Arabic. And we wanted someone from AUB to translate it and not the choice that Said made. And I think we were proven right. The translation was turgid and ultimately did a disservice, and therefore the Arabic reader did not understand the book if they only read it in Arabic.
Okay. Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
Before we continue?
Sure.
What was the effect of the fact that Arabic readers didn't understand the book? Did it have meaningful effect?
Yeah, I think so, because they just simplified this notion that he is pro-Islam and anti-Western. I mean, give me a break, guys. I mean, that's not what he was trying to do. He was trying to look at systems of domination, right? And how Orientalism is not only an idea, but a system of domination of the other. In this case, the Arab and Muslim other that he had in mind, right? He wasn't looking at China. He wasn't looking at Latin America. He was looking at this. So when you eliminate the concept of a system of domination, then you fall into the trap of a culturalist argument. So you become the Arab and Muslim equivalent of Sam Huntington, which is an interesting irony, because the two culturalist arguments are dead ends. They don't inform us anything. They don't teach us anything about the Arab world and the Muslim world, or about America. I mean, when you say the West, what does the West mean? Is it the West of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, or the West of Donald Trump? They are all part of the same. In other words, these broad concepts need to be broken down, to decipher what are the elements of domination and why you are struggling against the systems of domination, not the idea of them and us.
Yeah. Okay, I am gonna have you answer that final question. So you wouldn't have them start with Orientalism. What would you have them start with?
I think I would have them start with some of his essays, right? I would say Culture and Imperialism would be an important one. I would say his essays on Palestine and his political essays, right? I would go to those, right? And they've been collected in multiple books. Some of them appeared in Arabic. So I would go that route, right? So Culture and Imperialism, because Culture and Imperialism, he essentially develops the idea of resistance, right? So Orientalism as a system, but then he is critical of the likes of Foucault, who do not have an articulated understanding of resistance. And Said departs from that, although he liked Foucault, but he departs from Foucault, and he thinks systems are not just only dominating, they can be resisted. So Culture and Imperialism is the first major evidence of that, plus his essay. I would also read at least a book that he and Daniel Barenboim put together, Parallels and Paradoxes. What a beautiful exchange between the cultural critic Said and the major conductor Daniel Barenboim, and they became good friends throughout their life, about just the simplicity with which they deal with difficult concepts. I think that's a wonderful book. A Question of Palestine needs to be read in view of the massive amount of work that's been produced, especially with the apartheid, the ideas and settler colonial ideas and all that. So there's plenty since that book, but that book was original. He built on something that Rodinson had raised in a short essay in Le Temps Moderne, and Said popularized it more. And the book was popular. It sold a lot in America. So it's a path-breaking work. It's not his finest work, but it's a path-breaking work, nevertheless, given its historicity, right? So that's what I would do, and then just read something about his exile stories, right? He has a whole book called on exiles, about 607. Any of those essays, they're just beautiful. And they force you to think about the relationship between you and the world, right?
Yeah.
Not just limited to the Arab world or Africa or this. No, universal. He had a universal bent about him. And I think that's very alluring. And also, we need to think in those terms. That is, universal identity versus particular identities.
Yeah. Did he feel accepted in the Arab world in general?
I mean, he appreciated, he had some good friends in the Arab world, right? Uh, uh, he appreciated the friendships he had. I think he felt most comfortably in Beirut.
Yeah.
Even though Lebanon is the place where his father could not get a permit to be buried in Dur Shwer because he's Palestinian. He's an outsider. It's something he mentions in his memoir. But that aside, in Lebanon, he would meet people affiliated with the Lebanese Communist Party, other writers. Beirut was a multa, as you know, right? And I define one scene when I came to Beirut because Edward wanted me there to sign the contract with Hani Hindi to publish his Orientalism in Arabic. And then we went to a restaurant. I'm trying to remember the name. It was off Corniche, Syrian run, beautiful, a little oasis. You go in, you don't. I'll try to remember the name. And we were there with a Pakistani poet who was living in Beirut, and Iqbal Ahmad and me, and lo and behold, also Ashraf Ghani, who later became the president of Afghanistan. He was my classmate at AUB.
Wow.
And all of a sudden,
what a class.
They started reciting Urdu poetry. And after a few drinks, Edward and I started believing that we understood the Urdu poetry, right? So, so he had a special affinity. And then, of course, remember his wife is a Quaker, the daughter of a Quaker family from Lebanon, Qurtas.
Yeah.
Right? So he had an affinity to it. But he also had an affinity to Algerians, to this, people who engaged in ideas related to liberation, to literary critique, and all that. So he felt close to the Arab world. He lamented the despotism that destroys the lives of our people, which we see all the time, right? But he also was part of that world, right? He was very proud to be translated to Arabic, and also 30 other languages he was translated in, ultimately, all of his works. So he was part of the Arab world, and he was part of the West, and there is no contradiction between the two.
Yeah. Nubar, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for doing this. The book is called Edward Said, The Politics of an Oppositional Intellectual. You can find it anywhere. I'm enormously thankful to you for making the time for us.
I loved our conversation. I wish every conversation had this quality. So thank you.